She had been living 3 houses down from the woman who recognized her for almost 2 years before anyone said a word. That is the part that stays with you. Not the disappearance, not the long silence, not even the recovery. It is the quiet, ordinary proximity of it. The fact that Celeste Harlow had been buying groceries at the same store, walking the same sidewalk, nodding at the same mailboxes, and nobody, not a single person in that small Ohio neighborhood, had made the connection. Until one afternoon in March 2019, when a woman named Darlene Pruitt knelt down to help collect a torn grocery bag on the front step and noticed something on the back of the left thigh. A mark. Small. Faded. Almost hidden by the hem of a skirt. Darlene did not say anything at first. She helped collect the scattered items. She smiled. She went back inside her house and sat at her kitchen table for 40 minutes before she picked up the phone. What happened next would unravel a 15-year silence. It would bring federal agents back to a case most of the country had already forgotten. It would reunite a mother with a daughter she had searched for across 2 decades. And it would expose a structure of control so ordinary on its surface that its cruelty was almost invisible. But to understand any of that, you have to go back to October of 2004. To a Tuesday evening in a mid-sized town in Indiana. To a 14-year-old girl named Celeste Harlow, who left her school's autumn carnival with a boy she trusted, and was never seen again. If this kind of story matters to you, if you believe that names should be remembered and that silence should eventually be broken, stay with this. Because this one earned its ending. Celeste Harlow grew up in Grover Falls, Indiana. It was not a small town, but it felt like one. The kind of place where the same families appeared at the same events year after year. Where teachers remembered your older siblings. Where the post office clerk knew your mother's maiden name. Her mother, Tamsin Harlow, had raised Celeste and her older brother Derek largely on her own after their father relocated to Texas when Celeste was 6. There was no dramatic rupture, no court battle, no prolonged acrimony. Gary Harlow simply left, maintained sporadic contact for a few years, and then faded into the background of their lives like a station going out of range. Tamsin did not frame it as abandonment in front of her children. She called it a change in circumstances and moved on with the quiet efficiency of someone who had always known she would have to do most things herself. The household ran on Tamsin's schedule. She worked as a dental office administrator, a job she had held for 11 years by the time Celeste entered middle school. She woke early, packed lunches, attended every school event she could manage, and kept the house in a state of organized, functional order. She was not a warm woman in the demonstrative sense. She did not hug easily or speak in the language of feelings. But she was consistent, and Celeste understood consistency as its own form of love. Derek was 5 years older. He occupied that particular older sibling role of reluctant protector. He teased Celeste, defended her in public, and genuinely had no interest in the details of her social life unless something felt wrong. By October 2004, Derek was 19 and studying automotive technology at a vocational college 40 minutes from home. He came back most weekends. Celeste was 14. She was not a complicated teenager. That is not a diminishment. It is a clarification. She was not brooding or rebellious or consumed by crisis. She liked drawing, particularly architectural sketches of houses she imagined living in someday. She liked mystery novels. She was careful with her friendships, maintaining a small, reliable circle rather than the broader, louder social geography that defined many of her classmates. Her best friend was a girl named Brianna Coulter, who lived 4 blocks away and had known Celeste since 2nd grade. There was one particular quality that everyone who knew her mentioned consistently in the weeks after she disappeared. Celeste was observant. She noticed things. She remembered details about people that other teenagers overlooked. The kind of girl who would remember what you had been upset about 3 weeks earlier and ask if it had been resolved. She wore her dark hair in 2 low braids most days. She had a habit of chewing the end of her pencil when she was thinking. She kept a sketchbook on her desk that she had been filling since the previous spring with floor plans and exterior elevations, houses that did not exist except in her imagination. Comfortable houses. Houses with deep porches and shaded windows, and rooms arranged in ways that made sense to her, even if she could not fully explain why. She also had, on the back of her left thigh, a small birthmark. Diamond-shaped, roughly the size of a thumbprint, light in color. Her mother's physician had noted it during a routine examination and documented it without concern. It was not disfiguring. It was simply there. Celeste had no particular feeling about it. It was one of those physical details a person carries without ever thinking about. Sometime in early September 2004, about 6 weeks before she vanished, Celeste developed what her friends described as a crush on a boy named Cole Whitfield. Cole was 16. He attended the same school, Grover Falls Junior-Senior High, where the middle and upper grades shared a building with a connecting hallway. He was not a conspicuous student. No sports, no clubs, no particular academic distinction. He was the kind of teenager who moved through social spaces without accumulating much visibility. Average build, light brown hair worn slightly long at the collar, easy smile, comfortable in the skin of someone who understood how to appear harmless. Celeste's friends noticed she talked about him. Brianna later told investigators she had seen them speaking near the school entrance twice in late September. Nothing alarming. Just conversation. The ordinary choreography of a teenager deciding whether someone is worth trusting. The Autumn Carnival at Grover Falls Junior-Senior High took place on the evening of Friday, October 15, 2004. It was an annual event, modest by most standards. Booths, games, a small stage with student performances, food sold by the Parent Volunteer Association. Attendance was strong because the weather had stayed warm later than usual that year, and there was a particular ease in the air of that October that people remembered afterwards. The kind of autumn evening that feels borrowed from summer. Warm enough for short sleeves. The sky still bright past 7. Tamsin gave Celeste permission to attend with Brianna and 2 other friends. She set a return time of 9:30. Celeste said she understood. She left the house just before 6. She was wearing a green jacket over a white shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of canvas shoes she had owned since the previous spring and refused to replace despite the fact that the left sole had begun to separate slightly at the toe. Tamsin would describe that jacket in every subsequent interview, in every flyer, in every database entry. Green jacket, white shirt, dark jeans, canvas shoes, left sole separating at the toe. She would describe it for 15 years. At some point during the carnival, Celeste separated from Brianna. Witnesses later confirmed seeing her near the east side of the school grounds with Cole Whitfield around 8:15. They appeared to be talking. Nothing suggested distress. The setting was lit, populated, ordinary. Brianna tried to reach Celeste by phone just before 9. No answer. She assumed the battery had died. She told herself Celeste had probably started walking home and would be there when she arrived. By 10 o'clock, Celeste had not come home. Tamsin called Brianna. Brianna confirmed she had not seen Celeste since 8 o'clock. Tamsin drove the route between school and home twice. She checked the houses of 2 other friends. She called the school's main contact number and got an answering machine. At 11:15, she called the police. The Grover Falls Police Department took an initial report. The officer who responded, a man named Gerald Voigt, was thorough and unhurried. He noted the details. 14-year-old girl, last seen at a school event, approximately 8 o'clock that evening. No confirmed signs of distress. No known history of running away. He noted the name Cole Whitfield as someone who had been seen speaking with her. He told Tamsin that most cases like this resolved within 24 hours. Teenagers made impulsive decisions. They stayed at friends' houses without notifying parents. He said it without dismissiveness, but Tamsin heard the category before she heard the words. She was not in that category. She knew it the way a mother knows the difference between a daughter who might disappear and a daughter who would never choose to. By Saturday morning, the search began in earnest. Cole Whitfield was brought in for questioning on Saturday afternoon. He was nervous, visibly so, but his account was consistent and verifiable. He had spoken with Celeste near the east side of the grounds around 8:15. They had talked for perhaps 20 minutes. She had mentioned needing to find Brianna before the carnival ended. She walked in the direction of the main entrance. He had not seen her after that. Multiple students confirmed Cole's presence at the carnival well past 9 o'clock. His alibi held. He was not considered a primary person of interest after the first week, though investigators would revisit him several times in the months that followed. The phone records were pulled within days. Celeste's last outgoing call had been to Brianna at 8:04, just before the two had separated. Her phone had not been used again after that. The final cell tower registration placed her device within range of the school grounds at approximately 8:22. After that, nothing. A phone that stops transmitting is not silence. It is a specific kind of answer. Canvassing of the neighborhood around the school produced one piece of information that investigators noted without fully understanding its significance at the time. A homeowner on Breckenridge Avenue, which ran along the north edge of the school property, reported seeing an older model sedan parked on the street between 8 and 8:30. Dark color, possibly navy or charcoal. The witness could not confirm make or model. He had not thought to note the plate. That observation entered the case file. It would remain there for 15 years. The first 2 weeks of the investigation moved with the urgency that missing child cases demand. Flyers went up across Grover Falls and the surrounding counties. Tamsen appeared on 2 local television broadcasts, composed and precise, describing her daughter in concrete terms rather than emotional ones. Celeste was methodical. She was not impulsive. She did not leave without telling someone where she was going. Derek came home and stayed. He drove routes. He knocked on doors. He posted in online forums that, in 2004, were still relatively new as tools for missing person outreach. The school held an assembly. Students were asked to come forward with anything they had seen. Several additional witnesses confirmed Celeste's presence near the east grounds. None could push the timeline past 8:30. By November, the urgency had not vanished, but it had changed in character. The investigation continued. Tips were followed. But the rhythm shifted from immediate response to methodical persistence. There were no suspects. There was no evidence of violence at the school grounds. There was no body. There was no ransom. There was nothing. Just a girl who had been present, and then was not. And somewhere in the space between those 2 facts, a 15-year silence had already begun to build. What the investigation did not know in those early weeks, what it could not have known, was that the dark sedan on Breckenridge Avenue had not been there by accident. Federal investigators would reconstruct the relevant timeline years later, working backward from testimony and financial records and cell data that had not existed in 2004's investigative framework. What they pieced together suggested the following. Theodore Mast, 23 years old at the time, had been connected to a loosely affiliated network operating across Indiana and Ohio since at least 2002. The network was not large. It was not the kind of organization that appears in federal briefings with names and command hierarchies. It functioned more like a series of referrals. People who knew people. Logistics arranged between individuals who maintained plausible distance from one another. Mast had been at the school grounds on 2 documented occasions in the 6 weeks before October 15th. He had entered through a youth outreach program affiliated with a community center in an adjacent town. The program was legitimate in its official purpose. Its coordinator was unaware that Mast had been using it as cover for contact with students. He presented himself as a volunteer. He was sociable, unremarkable, the kind of presence that adults at community events accepted without scrutiny because he did not offer any obvious reason to scrutinize him. It was not clear whether he had made direct contact with Celeste during those visits. Investigators found no record of her reporting an unusual interaction in the weeks before the carnival. But they found something else, a pattern. Mast had been at 3 other community events in Indiana and Ohio in the 2 years prior. In each case, a teenager had been reported missing within 60 days of his documented attendance. Not one of those cases had been connected to the others in 2004. The connection required looking at all of them together, from a distance of years, with the benefit of frameworks that investigators in 2004 had not yet had access to. Here is the detail that matters for what comes next. The autumn carnival at Grover Falls was not the place Celeste disappeared from. It was the place she was identified. The disappearance was engineered before that evening. The carnival was simply the opportunity. How someone contacts a 14-year-old and persuades them to step into a car on a school evening with a large crowd nearby is a question that investigators ultimately could not answer with certainty, because the person who could answer it was Celeste, and her memories of that night, even after recovery, never fully surfaced. The specific mechanics of those 20 minutes on the east side of the school grounds remained a gap in the reconstructed record. What investigators could confirm was that by 9 o'clock on the evening of October 15, 2004, Celeste Harlow was no longer in Grover Falls. And what happened next would not become known for 15 years. Here is something that rarely appears in coverage of missing person cases. The years between the disappearance and the resolution are not empty. They are full. Full of small, grinding decisions that families make to survive the waiting. Full of systems that move slowly even when families push them hard. Full of moments where hope rises just enough to hurt, then recedes. Tamsin Harlow lived all of it. By the end of 2004, she had established contact with 3 national organizations focused on missing and exploited children. She learned the language of case management, the way someone learns a foreign language under pressure. She understood NCIC entries, the distinction between missing and endangered classifications, the difference between a cold case and an inactive case. She understood that inactive did not mean the same thing as closed, and she refused to let anyone in an official capacity treat it as though it did. She maintained a file. Not one file. Several. Organized by year, by contact, by follow-up status. She kept notes from every phone call with law enforcement. She retained every email. She printed and archived every tip that arrived through the website Derek built in early 2005, a single-page site with Celeste's photograph, the details of her disappearance, and a contact form. It was not elegant, but it stayed live for years. Derek paid the hosting fees when Tamsin couldn't, and Tamsin paid them when Derek forgot, and between the two of them the site never went dark. The photograph they used was from the previous spring. A school picture. Celeste looking directly at the camera with the particular expression teenagers adopt for school portraits. Not quite natural, not quite posed, somewhere in between. The green jacket was not in the picture. She was wearing a navy top. But the face was clear and the eyes were identifiable, and that mattered more than the clothing. By 2005, investigators at the state level had expanded their geographic reach. The Indiana State Police reviewed the case. Highway patrol officers along the I-74 corridor were briefed on Celeste's description. Nothing surfaced. No matches to unidentified individuals in morgues or hospitals across the region. No confirmed sightings. By 2006, the case had entered what investigators call a cold phase. Not closed. Cold. The distinction is procedural rather than substantive. Cold means the active investigation has been reduced to maintenance. Tips are still accepted and reviewed. Files are still accessible. But the daily resources, the door-to-door work, the consistent law enforcement attention, have been redirected toward cases with more recent evidence. Tamsin felt the shift immediately. She had been receiving regular calls from the department. Then the calls became monthly. Then quarterly. Then the calls came only when she initiated them, and the person who answered was often not the person who had handled the case the previous time, and she had to explain the history again to someone checking a file rather than living one. She responded by intensifying her own efforts. She built a second website, more detailed than the first. She added Celeste's age progression image, created with the help of a graphic design student who volunteered for a missing persons advocacy group and who understood how to account for the changes puberty and time would bring to a 14-year-old face. The progression updated every few years. The girl in the original school portrait became, gradually, a young woman in her 20s. Tamsin looked at each new progression and tried to see her daughter inside it. Derek completed his vocational certification and took a job at a repair shop in Grover Falls. He could not bring himself to move far from his mother. Later, he would say that leaving the town felt like abandoning the last place Celeste had been real. The logic was not logical. He understood that. He stayed anyway. Celeste's friend Brianna Coulter moved forward with her life in the way young people must. She attended college in Ohio. She completed a degree in early childhood education. She settled in Columbus, married a man named Richard, and had 2 children. She remembered Celeste on October 15th every year. On that date she did not post on social media or participate in public commemorations. She simply sat quietly for a few minutes and thought about the last conversation she could remember. Something about a drawing Celeste had been working on. A house with a particular kind of porch. Brianna could not recall the specific details of the drawing, only the way Celeste's face had looked when she described it. Focused. Pleased with herself. Like someone who had solved a problem. The years accumulated. By 2008, a national conversation about human trafficking had begun to shift. Advocacy organizations grew more sophisticated. Federal task forces expanded their reach. Awareness campaigns began connecting previously isolated cases through shared patterns. Interstate 74, which ran east-west through Indiana and into Ohio and Illinois, appeared in federal briefings as a corridor associated with trafficking movement in the Midwest. Grover Falls sat 12 miles from an I-74 interchange. This was not a revelation that reached Tamsin immediately. The connection between her daughter's disappearance and interstate trafficking routes emerged slowly, through the kind of accumulated context that takes years to assemble. A detective in Indianapolis who reviewed the case in 2009 mentioned it in a call with Tamsin. He did not present it as a conclusion. He presented it as a direction worth understanding. A dark sedan near a school. A phone that went dark cleanly, without any attempt at contact. A girl who vanished without witnesses past a certain point. These elements, taken individually, proved nothing. Taken as a pattern, they aligned with a profile investigators were seeing repeatedly in Midwestern disappearances. Tamsin absorbed the information. She filed it. She did not collapse into it, and she did not build a certainty she was not entitled to. By 2010, the case had received one significant external development. A non-profit organization focused on cold cases had reviewed Celeste's file and submitted it to a federal database cross-referencing unidentified individuals nationwide. The submission produced no immediate matches, but it kept the file in circulation. It kept the distinguishing features available for any investigator who might, years later, find themselves looking for a connection. One of those features was the birthmark. Small, diamond-shaped, left thigh. Documented in 2004 by Tamsin's family physician and entered into the record during the initial missing person filing. One fact, one feature, filed once and largely forgotten in the daily machinery of a cold case. 15 years later, it would become the pivot point of everything. The years between 2010 and 2015 had a particular texture. Not dramatic. Not loud with grief. The loudest version of Tamsin's grief had burned through the first year and settled into something steadier and more structural. She had learned, by necessity, how to carry it without being bent by the weight. She kept the website current. She responded to every message that arrived through the contact form, even the ones that were clearly not about Celeste. People who had read the page and wanted to share their own losses. Families of other missing children who had found the site through advocacy networks. Strangers who offered prayers and strangers who offered theories and strangers who simply wanted someone to hear that they were thinking about a girl they had never met. Tamsin answered them all. She also attended, starting in 2011, a support group for families of missing persons that met at a community center in Indianapolis the second Thursday of every month. She had resisted going for years. It felt too much like accepting a category she did not want to belong to. But a woman she had connected with through the advocacy network persuaded her, and she went, and what she found was not acceptance of loss. It was something more practical. A room of people who understood the specific grammar of waiting. Who understood that you could hold hope and rage and exhaustion simultaneously, and that none of those things canceled the others. She went every second Thursday for 4 years. By 2013, Celeste's case had been reviewed 3 additional times by investigators with fresh eyes. Each review was requested by Tamsin and accommodated by the department, which had assigned the case to a detective named Warren Holt following Gerald Voigt's retirement. Holt was thorough and direct. He told Tamsin plainly in their first meeting that he could not promise a resolution. He told her he could promise that the file would not become furniture, something existing on a shelf without anyone actually seeing it. He reviewed the original interviews. He re-interviewed 2 witnesses from the 2004 carnival who were still reachable. He re-examined the cell tower data with the benefit of more recent analytical tools. He pulled the note about the dark sedan on Breckenridge Avenue and submitted the vehicle description to an expanded database that had not existed in 2004. Nothing broke open. But Tamsin valued his effort and his honesty in equal measure. The 8th anniversary of October 15th arrived in 2012 with the particular weight that anniversaries gather when they stop being shocking and start being permanent. Noah, who was now 10 years old and had grown up entirely inside the household shaped by Celeste's absence, asked his mother at breakfast that morning how long people could be missing before they weren't missing anymore. Tamsin considered the question carefully. She said missing was not a category that expired. She said some people were found after very long times. She said the only thing that changed with time was not the possibility, but the patience required to hold it. Noah went to school. Tamsin called the department. She asked whether there was anything new. There was not. She updated the website anyway. A small addition. A note about the anniversary. A request for anyone with information to come forward. She had made the same note every year since 2005, and she would make it every year thereafter. Not because she expected it to produce a result that week, but because consistent visibility was its own form of pressure on the universe of chance. She did not know how right she was. By 2015, the national conversation about trafficking had shifted in ways that were starting to reach local investigators. Training programs for law enforcement across the Midwest were updated to include profiles of victims that looked different from the older frameworks. Not just physical abductions, not just immediate violence, but the more common reality of gradual manipulation, of victims who had been moved quietly and quickly, and who had not left evidence of struggle because the control had been more psychological than physical. Warren Holt attended one of those training sessions in Indianapolis in November 2015 and came back with a different set of questions. He called Tamsin 3 days later. He said he wanted to revisit something. He asked about the people Celeste had known in the 6 weeks before the carnival. Not just her close friends. The peripheral contacts. The people she might have spoken to in passing. The adults who had been present at school events. Tamsin went through everything she could recall. Everything she had documented. The interviews from 2004, which she had kept in the files. The names of teachers, of family friends, of community members who had passed through Celeste's world that autumn. Theodore Mast's name did not appear in any of those records. He had been careful. But the youth outreach connection surfaced in Holt's new review, a name on a sign-in sheet from a school wellness event in September 2004 that had previously not been examined closely. The name was listed as a volunteer. The community center affiliation was noted. Holt pulled the community center's records. The volunteer had signed in 3 times over 2 months. He had a prior address in a town 20 miles from Grover Falls. His current whereabouts in 2015 were unknown. Holt submitted the information to state investigators and flagged it for the FBI's Interstate Task Force. The flag reached the Cincinnati office. It was noted. It did not yet generate immediate action, because Mast's name was one of several in a review of multiple cold cases being worked simultaneously. It joined a list that was longer than any single investigator could address urgently in that season. But it was on the list. And lists have a way of becoming relevant at the right moment, when another piece of evidence arrives to give the existing information somewhere to land. By 2012, Celeste would have been 22. Tamsin allowed herself to age progress the image in her mind, not just in the graphics on the website, but in her daily life. When she passed young women on the street in Grover Falls or in Indianapolis when she visited her sister, she looked. Not compulsively, not with the desperation of someone who had lost their footing. With the quiet, habitual awareness of a woman who had trained herself to notice. She never confused anyone for Celeste. She was too grounded in specific detail for that. She knew the particular set of her daughter's jaw. She knew the way Celeste held her shoulders when she was uncertain about something. She knew the way her daughter's left eye narrowed very slightly before she laughed. She looked for these things in passing faces. None of them appeared. What she did not know was that Celeste, by this point, would not have been easily recognizable even to someone looking for her. The person who had been Celeste Harlow had been systematically buried beneath a constructed identity. New name, new history, new geography, new dependency. The process had been gradual rather than sudden, which made it more effective and more difficult to undo. Sudden displacement creates shock, and shock can galvanize resistance. Gradual displacement dissolves the foundations of resistance without announcing itself. The network that had taken Celeste had developed its methodology across years of operation. The people who ran it were not creative in any meaningful sense. They were consistent. They understood that identity was not a fixed object a person carried. It was a set of ongoing relationships, with memory, with habit, with community, with language. Sever enough of those relationships systematically, and the original identity loses coherence. Replace them with a new set of relationships, built on carefully constructed false history, and the replacement becomes increasingly functional. The first layer of that replacement was a name. Celeste had been given a name that was not hers. She had been given a history to accompany it. The history was partial and carefully vague in certain areas, but sufficient to support daily functioning. She understood that she was from Missouri. She understood that her family was not in the picture, described in terms that were discouraging enough to prevent inquiry. She understood that she owed certain debts. Those debts were never explicitly quantified, which meant they could never be satisfied. The second layer was geography. She was moved enough times in the early years that no single place became home. Not in the psychological sense of home, a place where your history is legible and your presence makes sense to people who knew you before. She moved through Ohio cities whose names she could recite without feeling any particular connection to them. The movement was not random. It was managed by the same logistics that managed the financial structure. Moves occurred when someone in the layer above determined they were necessary. They were necessary whenever a situation became too stable, too visible, too close to something that might eventually look like a life rather than an arrangement. The third layer was time. Years are a mechanism. They do not simply pass. They work. The longer a person lives inside a false identity, the more that identity accumulates its own small facts, its own routines, its own small autobiographical weight. A preferred brand of coffee, a particular route to work, a television program watched on certain evenings. None of these facts are meaningful on their own. Together, they begin to constitute a self, even a constructed one. They make the construction feel inhabited. They make questioning it feel like questioning your own existence. By the time Celeste had been inside the network for a decade, the original self had not been destroyed. Her therapists would later be careful to make this distinction. It had been insulated, wrapped in enough constructed experience that it could no longer be accessed through normal recollection. The memories were not gone. They were unreachable from the surface of daily life. They lived in sensation, and in the body's habits, and in the small persistent echoes that surfaced without explanation. She remembered certain things without knowing she remembered them. The specific weight of a pencil held at a particular angle. The smell of apple butter. A creak in a floor. A railing with a particular shape. These things existed in her without narrative, without context, without names attached to them. She had been taught not to trust them. The cleaning company in Calverton had employed her since 2016. It provided income, daily schedule, and a degree of normalcy that made the constructed life feel more stable than it was. The work was physical and repetitive. Office buildings, commercial spaces, occasional private residences. She cleaned well. She showed up reliably. Her supervisor had no complaints. He was not aware of the arrangements that had placed her in the job. He saw an employee who came in and did the work and went home without incident. She was good at being unseen. She had spent years practicing it. She moved through spaces efficiently. She kept her interactions brief and polite. She did not linger. She did not form friendships at work, not because she was incapable of warmth, but because warmth had been trained out of her as a strategic response. Warmth created attachment. Attachment created vulnerability. She had been taught that vulnerability was how bad things happened. There were moments, not many, but some, when something on the periphery of her awareness would catch in a way she could not explain. A song on a radio in a client's office. A particular quality of autumn light through a window. The smell of a cleaning product that reminded her of nothing specific and everything that could not be named. She would pause for a moment in those instances, holding the sensation carefully, and then the moment would pass and she would continue. She did not know what those moments were. She had no framework for understanding them as evidence of a self that had not consented to disappear. The house on Meridian Street was a later placement, arranged through the same financial structure that managed her employment. She had no say in the location or the terms. She paid rent from her wages directly to an account she had been told was a management service. She understood that the arrangement was not normal without being able to articulate exactly what normal would look like. The framework she had been given did not contain a vocabulary for what was being done to her. It contained a vocabulary for gratitude and compliance and the accumulated debt that could never quite be calculated or repaid. She lived in the house on Meridian Street because it had been arranged, not by her. Arrangements were not made by her. They were made in the layer above her, by the person who held the financial structure that translated her labor into housing and basic maintenance. She did not own the lease. She did not own anything. This is not a detail to pass over quickly. Ownership is not simply a financial concept. It is a relational one. When a person owns nothing, when their name appears on no document, when no institution recognizes their existence under their original identity, they occupy the world in a condition of radical invisibility. Not invisible in the sense of physically unseen. Visible in that sense, completely, but invisible in the sense that matters legally, institutionally, historically. Invisible in the sense that if they disappeared again tomorrow, there would be no record to search. The woman living on Meridian Street as Sheila Doran was exactly that kind of invisible. She had been invisible for over a decade. Until a skirt moved in flat afternoon light and a neighbor was paying attention. The mark behind Celeste's left thigh was not a tattoo in the traditional sense. It was a brand. Small, roughly diamond-shaped, approximately the size of a thumbprint. The scar tissue had settled pale and slightly raised against her skin. The kind of mark that would be invisible in most circumstances and visible only at close range in particular light. It had been placed there years into her time in the network, at a point when certain individuals within that structure were marked in ways that enforced ownership in the most direct possible terms. The placement was deliberate. The back of the upper thigh is a location rarely visible in ordinary social interaction. It is hidden by clothing in virtually all public settings. The only circumstances under which it becomes visible are intimate ones, or exactly the kind of circumstance that occurred on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-March 2019, when a bag gave way and a woman knelt and the light was flat. The placement over her natural birthmark was either a coincidence or an act of specific deliberateness. Investigators would later debate this. Some felt the network would have no reason to target a pre-existing mark. Others noted that placing a brand over a distinguishing feature would effectively disguise both marks simultaneously, one covering the other, each obscuring the significance of the other. It was an efficient solution, whether arrived at by calculation or accident. Either way, the result was the same. The thing that ultimately identified her was the thing that had been used to control her. The birthmark and the brand had become layered on the same patch of skin, and the only person who noticed, and who knew enough to look closer, was a woman who had watched a documentary on a church group evening 6 months earlier. Darlene Pruitt was 51 years old and had lived on Meridian Street for 18 years. She had raised 3 children in that house. Her husband worked in freight logistics. She volunteered Saturdays at a food pantry connected to her church. She was not a dramatic person. She noticed things the way people who spend long years in one neighborhood develop peripheral awareness. Not surveillance. Simply the unconscious registry of what belongs and what is slightly out of place. The woman at the house 3 doors down had moved in approximately 20 months earlier. She went by the name Sheila. She was quiet. She did not initiate conversation. She received packages occasionally. She drove a gray compact car and left at consistent hours. She did not appear to have guests. Not once in 20 months had Darlene seen another person enter or leave that house. Darlene had spoken to her perhaps 6 or 7 times over those 20 months. Brief exchanges. Weather. The bin schedule. Once, a question about a plumber's number. The woman called Sheila was polite in a way that felt practiced. Friendly without being warm. Present without being available. On a Wednesday afternoon in mid-March 2019, Darlene was returning from the corner store with 2 bags of groceries when she saw the woman from the house 3 doors down on her own front step. One of the bags the woman was carrying had given way at the seam. Oranges and a carton of broth had tumbled onto the step and the small walkway below. Darlene helped collect them. She knelt to retrieve an orange that had rolled to the edge of the step, and as she did, the woman bent to take it from her. The skirt shifted. The light was at a specific angle, flat afternoon light that flattened shadows and made surfaces stark. And on the back of the left thigh, just below where the hem usually sat, Darlene saw the mark. She had seen a mark exactly like it in a documentary about human trafficking that her church group had watched together the previous autumn. She remembered a woman in the documentary describing it. The shape, the placement, the significance. Darlene had not thought about that documentary since the evening she watched it. Until that moment. She finished collecting the groceries. She helped carry one of the bags to the door. She said something ordinary about the bags at that store never being reliable. The woman called Sheila thanked her with the same practiced politeness. The door closed. Darlene walked back to her house. She sat at her kitchen table. She stayed there for 40 minutes. Then she called the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The call Darlene made connected her with a specialist trained to gather preliminary information without alarm. Darlene described what she had seen clearly. The mark behind the thigh. The placement. The approximate size. The woman's demeanor over the 20 months of intermittent contact. The address on Meridian Street. The specialist asked a set of specific questions. Had the woman ever appeared to be under physical supervision? Had she ever expressed distress? Did she appear to move freely? Darlene answered carefully. The woman seemed to move freely, she said. But free and voluntary were not always the same thing. She had learned that distinction from the documentary. She mentioned it. The call was logged and flagged. Within 48 hours, it had been reviewed by an analyst connected to the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force based in Cincinnati. The task force operated across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, with interdisciplinary connections to Federal Operations Tracking Movement along I-74, I-70, and I-75. The analyst noted the description of the brand. It matched a pattern that investigators had been tracking across a network operating between Indiana and Ohio for several years. Not a large network. It functioned more like a franchise. Independent operators connected through shared logistics, shared financial intermediaries, and a shared methodology for maintaining control. The cleaning company in Calverton had appeared peripherally in related investigations before, flagged but not yet fully examined. Investigators approached the Meridian Street address with care. Surveillance began. For 6 days, agents documented comings and goings without making contact. The woman drove to the cleaning company and returned. She stopped at the grocery store twice. She did not appear to meet with anyone. She received no visitors. On the 7th day, a female agent made contact under a cover identity in a nearby parking lot. A brief exchange. Dropped keys, easy conversation. Eye contact held for a moment. What the agent observed she would later describe with particular precision. The woman was present and responsive. She spoke normally. But there was a quality in her composure that the agent recognized immediately from previous cases. It was not ease. It was the performance of ease by someone who had practiced it long enough for it to replace the original. The composure of someone who had learned, at a cellular level, that relaxation was not safe. The agent returned to the task force. She recommended a different kind of approach next time. Meanwhile, the name Sheila Doran was run through every available database. The Social Security number attached to the address had been issued to an infant born in Missouri in 1987 who had died at age 2. A dead identity. The kind of paperwork that functions perfectly until someone looks directly at it. When investigators looked directly at it, Sheila Doran did not exist. The woman on Meridian Street had no verifiable identity in any federal database. She was, officially, no one, except that she had been someone. She had been someone for a very long time. And somewhere in the records of a case from Grover Falls, Indiana, her original identity had been waiting for 15 years. The task force analyst who made the connection did so on a Thursday evening, working past the end of her shift, running missing person files from Indiana against the parameters established by the Meridian Street surveillance. Age range, geographic proximity to I-74, timeline consistent with the network's known period of activity. The list was not long, but it was not short either. Indiana alone had dozens of open missing person cases from the relevant decade that had not been resolved. The analyst worked through them methodically. She eliminated by age, by geography, by date. She was looking for a particular combination. Female. Disappeared in the early 2000s. From a community with I-74 access. No confirmed evidence of voluntary departure. Celeste Harlow's file appeared 23 entries into the list. The analyst opened it. She read through the initial report. The Carnival. The dark sedan on Breckenridge Avenue. The cell tower going dark at 8:22. She noted the absence of a confirmed motive for flight. She noted the documentation from the first week of the investigation, which was unusually thorough. The product of a family that had pushed hard from the first hour. She reached the section on distinguishing features. Small birthmark. Left thigh. Diamond-shaped. Approximately 1 inch in diameter. light in color. She read it twice. She sat back in her chair. Then she pulled up the surveillance report from Meridian Street and reread the physical description of the woman under observation. Height, build, approximate age, hair, and in a note from the preliminary contact made in the parking lot, a detail the observing agent had recorded because she trained herself to record every physical detail regardless of apparent significance. Small scar-like mark, left posterior thigh, visible during approach when subject's skirt shifted. The analyst read the two descriptions side by side. Diamond-shaped birthmark, left thigh, 2004 documentation. Scar-like mark, left posterior thigh, 2019 observation. She did not allow herself certainty. She understood what good practice required. But she also understood that the overlap was not casual. The shape, the location, the placement. The age of the woman on Meridian Street against the age Celeste Harlow would have been in 2019. She picked up the phone. The request for DNA comparison was authorized the following morning. It required Tamsin Harlow's cooperation, which the task force supervisor requested in a call placed on a Tuesday evening. Tamsin was in her kitchen. She had eaten dinner early. She was paging through a catalog the way people do when they need something to do with their hands. The supervisor introduced herself. She was not offering confirmation. She explained that an individual had been located in Ohio whose profile matched Celeste's documentation in several notable respects. She explained that no conclusion could be drawn until biological comparison was completed. Tamsin set the catalog face down on the table. She pressed the phone against her ear and did not speak for 3 seconds. Then she said yes. She said yes to the comparison. She said yes to providing any additional biological material required. She said yes to being contacted immediately when results were available. After the call ended, she sat in the kitchen for a long time. She did not call Derek. She needed a few minutes first. She needed the space between what she had been told and what she allowed herself to feel to remain precisely measured. 15 years of training herself to hold hope at arm's length does not dissolve in one phone call. But it shifts. The architecture of it changes. Something releases that has been held rigidly for so long that the release is almost indistinguishable from more holding. The DNA comparison was completed within 72 hours of formal contact being made with the woman on Meridian Street. The approach had occurred on a Thursday morning. 2 agents, a female lead, a third waiting near the vehicle. Identification presented. An explanation offered rather than a demand extended. The woman had opened the door and assessed the agents with the particular caution of someone who had spent years reading the nature of unexpected arrivals. The lead agent spoke calmly. She said they were not there because of anything the woman had done. She said they were there because they believed she might be someone a family had been searching for. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. It was conducted with a specialist in trauma-informed practice who worked regularly with survivors of prolonged coercive control. Questions were open-ended. The process was unhurried. Her name, she said, was Sheila. She had been told she was from Missouri. She understood that the history she had been given was not entirely consistent. There were gaps in it she had learned not to examine. The original, whatever it had become inaccessible, the way a room becomes inaccessible when the door has been closed long enough that you stop trying the handle. When the specialist asked about the mark on her left thigh, the woman looked at her for a moment. Then she said she had been told it was a birthmark. The specialist told her it was not. That was the moment. Not a breakthrough. A hairline fracture in a wall that had been standing long enough to feel permanent. The DNA comparison returned its result 41 hours after collection. The woman on Meridian Street shared a biological match with Tamsin Harlow at a statistical probability exceeding 99.99%. Jane Doe was Celeste Harlow. Alive. 28 years old. Found in Calverton, Ohio. Missing since October 15, 2004. Tamsin received the confirmation on a Saturday morning. The supervisor spoke the words directly. The DNA match was confirmed. The woman in Ohio was Celeste. Tamsin heard it. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, that she needed to tell her son. Derek was at the house within 20 minutes. He had received a message that said, "Only come home now." He arrived expecting the worst kind of news. After 15 years of calls at odd hours, he had become fluent in preparation for the worst. Instead, his mother told him his sister was alive. He sat on the couch in the living room that had not changed substantially since 2004. He put his hands over his face for a long moment. Not grief. Something on the other side of grief that does not have an easy name. Federal investigators briefed the family over the following days. They explained that Celeste had been living inside a constructed identity for a very long time. They explained that memory and identity in cases of prolonged psychological manipulation did not restore themselves simply because external circumstances had changed. They warned against expecting immediate recognition. They prepared the family for the possibility that the reunion would not resemble what they had imagined. Tamsin had imagined that reunion many thousands of times over 15 years. She set aside every version of it she had built. The first meeting was arranged at a facility in Columbus, not the Meridian Street address, not Grover Falls, a neutral space with therapeutic support present throughout. It occurred on a Wednesday morning in mid-April 2019, 16 days after Darlene Pruitt had knelt on a front step to help collect groceries. Tamsin walked into the room and saw her daughter for the first time in 14 years, 8 months, and 11 days. Celeste sat in a chair near the window. Her dark hair was shorter than Tamsin remembered. Her hands were folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who had learned to take up less space than they needed. She looked at the woman entering the room with the careful assessment of someone who had been trained to read arrivals for what they cost. Tamsin did not move quickly. She crossed the room slowly and sat in the adjacent chair and did not ask for recognition. She said her own name. She said she was Celeste's mother. She said she had been looking since October 2004. The woman in the chair listened. Her expression was careful. not blank. Careful. The difference matters. Then Tamsin described the house in Grover Falls, not in general terms, in specific ones. The smell of the kitchen in autumn when she made apple butter on Sunday afternoons. The way the third step on the staircase made a particular sound under the left foot, not the right. Only the left. The color of the curtains in Celeste's room, a dark yellow that Celeste had chosen herself and that everyone else had thought was too bright and that Tamsin had agreed to anyway because her daughter had been insistent. The woman called Sheila sat very still. Then she said quietly that the stair sounded different on the other side. She meant the right foot, not the left. She was correcting the detail. She had not been given the detail. She could only know it if she had lived it. Tamsin looked at her daughter. She did not rush into it. She stayed present. It took 3 more meetings before Celeste used her own name without prompting. It took longer than that before the past began to return in fragments. But it had begun. Something had been restored in the space of one small, precise memory of a stair. The investigation into the network that had held Celeste for 15 years expanded significantly in the months that followed her identification. Federal prosecutors in both Indiana and Ohio built a case across multiple jurisdictions. The work required tracing movement through a corridor that had operated quietly for over a decade, using I-74 and its feeder routes as infrastructure for something that looked, from any given point, like ordinary freight movement. The cleaning company in Calverton was directly implicated. Its owner, a man named Russell Gant, was arrested in July 2019. He had operated the company for 9 years. His role in the network was logistical and financial. He managed placement and ensured that financial movement through the company's accounts had sufficient cover to withstand surface-level scrutiny. He was not the architect. He cooperated partially in exchange for sentencing consideration. His cooperation produced 3 additional arrests in Indiana. The individual investigators believed had made initial contact with Celeste in October 2004 was identified through a combination of Gant's testimony and cell tower records pulled from the original case file. His name was Theodore Mast. He had been 23 at the time of the disappearance and had lived in a community adjacent to Grover Falls. He had not attended Grover Falls Junior-Senior High, but he had been documented on its premises twice in September and October 2004 through the Youth Outreach Program. By the time investigators connected him to Celeste's case, Mast had already been serving time in a federal facility in Illinois on an unrelated conviction. The new indictment was substantially more serious. He faced federal trafficking charges with evidence connecting him to multiple victims across a period of years. He did not cooperate. His trial proceeded on the evidentiary record assembled by the task force, which was extensive enough to proceed without his participation. Cole Whitfield, who had spoken with Celeste at the carnival in 2004, and who had spent 15 years under the shadow of intermittent suspicion without ever being charged, was formally cleared in June 2019. He was 31 years old. He had left Grover Falls after high school and settled in Michigan. He was married. He had followed the story when the identification was announced and called the Grover Falls Police Department himself to ask whether his name could be removed from any official documentation. It was. The dark sedan on Breckenridge Avenue was never definitively traced, but the vehicle description matched a model registered to a company associated with the network's Indiana logistics arm. The connection could not be established with full evidentiary certainty. It did not need to be. It occupied the right place in a pattern that had already been established by other means. The detail that had sat unresolved for 15 years finally had a context, even if it could not provide a conclusion. Celeste's recovery was not linear. It is important to say that plainly. She remained in Ohio for the first 4 months. The therapeutic team working with her specialized in dissociation and identity reconstruction following prolonged coercive control. The work proceeded at her pace, not the pace the investigation required, not the pace her family needed. The pace her own cognitive and emotional system could manage. The constructed identity, Sheila Doran, did not dissolve cleanly. It had been assembled over 15 years. It contained the only adult self Celeste had ever known. The person she had been at 14 had never had the chance to grow up on her own terms. A replacement had been built on top of that person, layer by layer, through years of isolation and managed dependency and the steady replacement of authentic memory with false history. Her therapists explained this to the family early. They used the term overlaid identity. They explained that the goal was not to strip away the constructed self abruptly, but to build connection with the original self gradually, so that Celeste could eventually integrate both into something continuous and livable. They explained that some memories would return. Some would not. Some might return in ways that were fragmentary and resistant to sequence. Tamsin received this information and adjusted. She did not arrive at meetings expecting her daughter to perform the return she had imagined. She arrived with specific memories, with small sensory details. The texture of a particular blanket. The smell of the soap she had used when the children were young. The precise sequence of a card game the family had played on Sunday evenings in the winters before 2004. Derek brought a drawing. Not one of Celeste's originals, which had not survived. He described one from memory. A house she had sketched in a notebook in the summer of 2004. A wide porch. A particular kind of railing that had a specific curve to it. When he described the curve of the railing, Celeste looked at him without speaking. Then she said it had extended at an angle on the left side, like a question mark turned sideways. She had described a detail Derek had not included in his account. He looked at her across the table in the facility in Columbus. He was 34 years old. He had not cried in front of another person since the first week after she disappeared. He did not cry then, but whatever the equivalent of that is in a person who has spent 15 years learning to carry grief quietly was present in the room. Everyone in it felt it. The family did not rush the process toward Grover Falls. Tamsin asked the therapeutic team whether returning would help or harm, and the answer was measured. It depended on readiness. It depended on whether the return was Celeste's choice rather than the family's need. It became Celeste's choice in September 2019, 5 months after her identification. She asked to see the house. The drive from Columbus to Grover Falls takes approximately 3 hours. Tamsin drove. Derek sat in the back. Celeste sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape shift from suburban Ohio into the particular flatness of the Indiana interior. She did not speak much. She was processing geography the way someone processes it when the body knows something the conscious mind is still assembling. When the car turned onto the street where the house stood, Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without being asked, that the tree in the neighbor's yard across the street had been smaller. It had been 14 years since she had seen it. The tree had grown. Inside the house, she moved carefully. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time. She placed her hand on the railing at the foot of the staircase and did not move it for a moment. Then she put her left foot on the third step. It made no sound. She put her right foot on the third step. The particular creak, the one her mother had mentioned in their first meeting, sounded exactly as it had in 2004. Celeste stood on that step for a moment and did not say anything. She did not need to. Brianna Coulter received Celeste's message on an October afternoon in 2019, on the 15th anniversary of the disappearance. It came through the contact information Brianna had posted publicly for years in connection with an annual remembrance she had kept private. The message was short. It said she remembered the drawing of the house. It said the porch had extended on the left side. Brianna replied within minutes. She said she remembered that the railing had a particular curve. They met for coffee 2 weeks later in Columbus, roughly equidistant between where each of them lived. They sat for 3 hours. Some of it was difficult. Some of it was ordinary. By the end, something had been rejoined that 15 years had not broken, only stretched to its absolute limit. The difficult part of that conversation was not the years themselves. It was the edges of them, the places where what Celeste remembered and what Brianna remembered met and did not quite align. Because memory is not a recording and 15 years had shaped each of them differently, and the girl they had both known was neither of them exactly. But at the center of all of it, underneath the difficulty and the awkwardness and the enormous weight of time, something genuine was still present. The friendship had not been destroyed. It had simply been waiting, the way some things wait, in a form more durable than the circumstances that surrounded it. Brianna cried. She apologized for crying. Celeste told her she did not need to apologize. That was, in its small way, significant. The capacity to receive another person's emotion, to hold space for it without retreating, was not a given. It was something that had been suppressed systematically for 15 years. Its return was not automatic. It came back in the same way everything came back, in fragments, through practice, through the accumulation of small safe experiences that demonstrated, gradually, that warmth did not lead to punishment. The formal legal proceedings continued through 2020 and into 2021. Theodore Mast was convicted on federal trafficking charges that reflected both the specific case involving Celeste and the broader pattern of conduct across multiple victims. Russell Gant received a separate sentence. Additional members of the network received various outcomes depending on the evidence against each and the extent of their cooperation. Celeste did not testify in person during the initial proceedings. The decision was made in coordination with prosecutors and her therapeutic team. The evidentiary case was sufficient to proceed without requiring her direct participation at that stage. She was kept informed. She understood the process. She supported the approach. Warren Holt, the Grover Falls detective who had reviewed the case in 2013 and flagged Theodore Mast's name 2 years later, retired in 2021. He was invited to attend the sentencing hearing as a courtesy. He attended. He did not speak to the press afterward. He said in a brief statement to the department that the outcome reflected the persistence of a family rather than any single act of investigative brilliance. That persistence, he said, had kept the information available long enough for the right connections to be made. That was accurate. It was also slightly modest. The flag he had placed in 2015 had connected to the Cincinnati Task Force's existing list at exactly the right moment. Without that connection, Mast's name might have remained in a state database without triggering federal-level review. Persistence and attention had operated in combination. Neither alone would have been sufficient. Later, in a subsequent civil proceeding, Celeste provided a written statement. It was read into the record by her attorney. It was measured and precise. It described what had been done, what it had cost, what it meant, not only for her, but for anyone who had experienced the same architecture of control. It was, by most accounts, the most clarifying document in a case that had accumulated thousands of pages of material. By the spring of 2020, 1 year after her identification, Celeste had returned to Grover Falls. She did not move back into her mother's house. She rented a small apartment on the east side of town, 2 rooms with a window that looked onto a yard where someone had planted late-season sunflowers. She chose it herself. She furnished it herself. Both of those facts mattered in ways that were difficult to articulate but important to notice. Choosing something and carrying it out for yourself, without consulting a layer of authority above you, without checking whether the choice was permitted, without the anxiety of unknown consequences, is not a neutral act for someone emerging from 15 years of controlled dependency. It is a practice. It requires doing it once, and then doing it again, and gradually building a reliable interior sense that the choosing belongs to you. She chose the apartment. Then she chose a kitchen table from a second-hand store on the south side of town. Then she chose a rug. Then curtains, a pale green that her mother found disconcerting and that Celeste found exactly right, though she could not have said why. She enrolled in a community college course that autumn. One course. Architectural design, foundational level. She had not planned the choice consciously. She signed up and then, only afterward, remembered the sketchbook from 2004. The first assignment in the class required students to sketch a structure from memory. Something they knew well. A place that had been significant to them. Celeste sat in front of a blank page for a long time. Then she drew a porch. Wide and shaded. with a wooden railing that had a particular curve on the left side, like a question mark turned sideways. She had not drawn anything in 15 years. Her hands had not forgotten. She continued working with her therapist. The work was ongoing in the way that all serious work is ongoing. Not catastrophic, not dramatic. Continuous and directed toward something real. There were weeks that were harder than others. There were sessions that surfaced things she had not known were still there, waiting. Memory, when it returns from a long absence, does not arrive in order. It arrives the way sediment shifts in disturbed water, in clouds rather than clear lines, settling slowly into something approaching legibility. She approached those sessions the way she had always approached difficult things. Methodically, without rushing, with the observant patience of a person who had always noticed more than she said. 1 year after returning to Grover Falls, Celeste Harlow sat in the community center at an event hosted by a national trafficking awareness organization. She was on a small panel alongside 2 advocates, a survivor from a different case, and a federal investigator from the Cincinnati Task Force. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She said that the hardest part of recovery was not the past. The past could be documented. It existed in records and photographs and testimony. The hardest part was the present tense of identity. The question of who you were when the person you had been told you were had been constructed under duress, and the person you had started as was 14 years old and therefore also no longer fully you. She said she had come to understand identity not as a fixed thing that could be lost and then returned to, but as something built continuously. She said the construction that had been done to her without her consent had not cancelled the construction she was doing now with her own hands. She said the stair still creaked on the right foot. She had checked. She said she was not a symbol of anything except a person who had survived a particular set of circumstances and who was now occupied with the business of being here. She said she was grateful in specific terms, not for the experience, for the people who had held the space open. A mother who renewed website hosting fees every year for 15 years. A friend who had kept a detail about a porch railing in her memory for over a decade. A neighbor who had watched a documentary and then, at the right moment, paid attention. She said attention was not passive. Then she thanked the audience and returned to her seat. Behind the left thigh, the mark remained. She had considered having it removed. She had researched the procedure. She had made and cancelled an appointment twice. She had not removed it. Not because it represented something she wanted to preserve. The network that had placed it there deserved no preservation. The years it marked were not years she wished to memorialize. She kept it for a simpler reason. It had been the thing that brought her home. Not Tamsen's persistence alone, though that mattered. Not the federal investigation alone, though that mattered. Not the DNA match, though that had confirmed everything. The chain had needed a beginning. The beginning had been a neighbor kneeling on a front step, in flat afternoon light, collecting an orange that had rolled to the edge. Without the mark, Darlene might have stood back up and gone inside. Without Darlene's call, the task force analyst would not have pulled the file. Without the file, the diamond-shaped birthmark entered in Tamsen's original 2004 report would not have been cross-referenced against a diamond-shaped scar in Ohio. The chain ran back through 15 years to a single biological detail that Celeste had carried since birth. A mark she had no say in and no knowledge of. Hidden under clothing. Then hidden under something else entirely. Until an afternoon in March 2019, when a skirt shifted and the light was flat and a neighbor was paying attention. She kept it because some things endure not because they are beautiful but because they are true. Because they are specific. Because they are the particular detail that no approximation can replace. Because sometimes the only thing that cannot be taken from you is the thing nobody thought to look for. In the United States, tens of thousands of children are reported missing every year. The majority are recovered quickly. A significant portion are not. Some cases remain unresolved for years. Some for decades. Some permanently. Tamsen Harlow knew this. She had known it for every one of the 15 years she maintained the file. The website, the annual contacts, the database entries. She knew it while she held hope in a form that could withstand sustained pressure without breaking. She never used the word closure. She found the concept insufficient. She preferred a different word. Continuity. A story that had been interrupted rather than ended. A thread that had been extended, invisibly, through years of silence, until the moment it became visible again. The year after Celeste's return, Tamsen began volunteering with the same national organization through which Celeste eventually gave her panel interview. She was not a natural public speaker. She was too precise for the kind of emotional delivery that advocacy events sometimes rewarded. But precision, it turned out, was exactly what those rooms needed. Families of the missing did not always need to be told to hope. They needed to be told, in specific terms, what they could actually do. How to keep a case accessible. How to communicate with investigators in ways that produced responses. How to maintain a digital presence for a missing person without consuming every hour of every day. Tamsen knew all of that. She had learned it the hard way, over 15 years, at significant personal cost. She offered it freely. She spoke at 6 events in the first 2 years. She did not describe Celeste's story in detail at most of them. The story was available in the press. What she offered instead was the methodology. The unglamorous, repetitive practice of keeping a record alive. The specific value of detailed physical descriptions, which she illustrated with the birthmark, the single fact that had eventually connected 2 records separated by 15 years and 400 miles. She said the birthmark had been documented by a physician in 2004 for a routine pediatric file. No one had thought of it as important. It had been transcribed into a missing person report as a matter of procedure. It had sat in a federal database for 15 years without ever generating a match. And then one day in 2019, at exactly the right moment, it had become the most important piece of information in the entire case. She told families to document everything, every physical detail. every distinguishing mark, however minor. She told them to update their records when those details changed or aged. She told them that the detail they dismissed as irrelevant might be the one that mattered. She said this not because she had known it in 2004. She had not known it. She said it because she had learned it at the cost of 15 years. Darlene Pruitt gave one interview to a reporter from a Calverton newspaper. She kept it brief. She said she had done what any person who paid attention would have done. She said she hoped more people would pay attention. She declined to characterize herself as a hero, specifically and explicitly, because she felt that the word redistributed credit away from the family that had never stopped searching and the investigators who had done the actual work. She went back to volunteering at the food pantry the following Saturday. She continued watching documentaries with her church group on Thursday evenings. She never mentioned the case again in public. There is a particular kind of courage that looks exactly like ordinary behavior. Darlene Pruitt sitting at her kitchen table for 40 minutes before making a call is not a dramatic image. It does not produce a striking scene. It is a woman sitting with the weight of what she had noticed, deciding whether to act on it, choosing to trust that what she had seen was what it appeared to be, and picking up the phone. That choice was made in private, without an audience, without the guarantee of outcome, without any particular certainty that she was right. She was right. And that is the most unremarkable and important thing about the whole story. Celeste's story does not instruct anyone to expect the same outcome. Not every silence breaks. Not every mark is noticed. Not every chain of unlikely events aligns. But some do. And the ones that do align because somewhere inside a structure designed to make everything invisible, one thing remained. One specific, stubborn, irreducible trace of an original identity. A shape on the skin. A creak on a stair. A curve in a railing that extended like a question mark turned sideways. A 14-year-old sketchbook filled with houses she had imagined living in. Houses with deep porches and shaded windows and rooms arranged in ways that made sense to her even if she could not explain why. The girl who had drawn those houses had not disappeared. She had simply been buried under everything that was done to her. And when the right person looked at the right thing at the right moment, she began to surface. The process was not instant. It was not clean. It took years of careful work and therapeutic patience and a family's willingness to meet her where she was rather than where they needed her to be. But it happened. The particular detail that remembers you when you cannot remember yourself. She remembered the curve of the railing. She remembered the stair that creaked on the right foot. She remembered the angle of a porch she had never finished drawing. She finished drawing it eventually. She keeps it on the wall of the apartment on the east side of Grover Falls, in the room with the window that looks onto the yard with the sunflowers. She has not moved it. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that attention matters and that persistence is its own form of love, we would be grateful if you pressed like, shared this with someone who values true stories, and subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. The families who refuse to stop looking deserve witnesses. You can be one of them. Thank you for staying until the end.